Hey everyone, in this video we're going to be working on another front-end eval question. If you don't know what front-end eval is, it is a platform with free exercises so you can practice for modern front-end development interviews. I've been working with the creators of front-end eval and they are tirelessly working on creating more questions for you so that you can land that job as a front-end developer. In the last video, we worked on the multi-step form, and in this video, we're going to be working on the modal overlay. So let's get to it. Let's read the prompt and then we'll get to the code. In the prompt, we are going to create a dismissible modal overlay. The UI should initially show a show offer button, which when clicked, displays an overlay resembling the mockup below, including a transparent gray over the background. The modal should be vertically and horizontally centered and always in the same position regardless of scrolling. If the user clicks anywhere on the gray background or the X, the modal should be dismissed and the UI should again just show the show offer button. However, if the user clicks the accept offer button, the modal will dismiss and the UI should now show the text offer accepted. So let's get to the code. Right now I'm in a code sandbox and it's fairly empty. All it has is a styles.css, an index.js, and an index.html. The first thing I want to do is come up with a game plan. So I'm just going to kind of number it down based on my kind of thought process. Number one should be creating a layout template of the modal. The second can be the styling of the modal. The third is close functionality of the modal. And then fourth, we can create the layout of the, the show offer with CSS. And then we can kind of work on the JavaScript aspect of open and closing a modal. And then last but not least, render the success page. So let's kind of just do these one by one. The first thing I'm going to do is work on creating the layout template of the modal. So here, I'm just going to create a div with a class of modal overlay. And we'll also give it an ID of modal. And inside of the modal itself, we want to give a div.content where we're going to keep all the content and the information. And inside of the content, we have a button called close modal button, and we'll give it an X. The next thing we're going to do is give it a p tag with a class of modal text. And we'll say click the button below to accept our amazing offer. Enter. Sweet. Last but not least, we'll give it a button with a class of submit modal button. And here we'll just say accept offer. And in our button class, what I forgot to do was give it a type of button. And here, let's also give this a type equals button. Sweet. I'm just going to move this to the right. So obviously right now, our modal isn't actually a modal. It's just div elements on a template. But what we can do now is add some CSS styling to it to give it a feel and look of a modal. So let's open up our styles.css here. And in our styles.css, we're going to add some styles. I'm going to keep the index.html on the bottom just to make it a little bit easier to work with. So in our modal overlay, we're going to add a background color of RGBA 0.0, 0, 0.5. That's going to give it some black color with some opacity. And next thing we're going to do is give it a height of 100 viewport height. We're going to give it a width of 100 viewport width. We're also going to make this position fixed so it never moves beyond the scrolling. And also give it a top of 0, a left of 0. And now we need to center it. So we'll do display flex, justify content center. which will move it horizontally. And last but not least, let's do align items center, which will align them in the vertical context. So we got that out of the way. So it's getting there. It's getting there. Now we need to give this modal content some styles. And I did mess up here. We're supposed to make this modal content. It doesn't really matter in the grand scheme of things, but it's good to be specific with your class names here. So that's kind of what I'll say about that. So in our modal content, we'll give it a background color of FFFF. We'll also give it a padding of maybe 25 pixels. Sweet. And we'll give it a min width of 250 pixels, maybe a max width of 400 pixels, and then width 30%. So this is just a little bit for responsiveness. And then we'll do display flex, justify content. Actually, nope. We need to do flex direction column, which will change the flex direction. And last but not least, let's just align items center and position relative. Right now our X is in the center because of the flex positioning, but what we're going to do is give our modal content a position relative, and we'll then give our button a position of absolute to move it to the left and to the top. So here we'll just say close modal button, position absolute, top of 0, left of 0, which we technically don't want to do. I was just trying to show you how the top and left worked. And then here, let's just give it a background of transparent and border of none. Sweet. Now I think the styling looks pretty good for modal here. And what do we need to do next? So we got this done. We got the styling of the modal done. And now we need to figure out the close functionality. So in our index.js, let's just create a class called modal that will kind of do more or less all the functionality of our modal. And here, let's just say const modal equals modal. And here, we're going to do a little bit of magic. So let's just open up our index.html and let's figure out how do we close the button. And I'm going to just do a search for this close modal button and then add an event listener to it. So just for the sake of this example, I'm going to say const close modal button L equals document.query selector of close modal button. And here we're going to add event listeners. So we're going to say close modal button element dot class list. Actually, no, it's add event listener to the click. And we need to do something here. So what do we need to do? We need to hide this modal, right? Whenever we close the modal. And how do we hide the modal? We can use some CSS magic to basically display none whenever a modal is closed, and then remove that display none characteristic whenever you want to show the modal. So in our styles.css, what we can do here is we could create a hidden class called hidden, and we could give it a display of none. So what we're going to do with the JavaScript is target these elements and hide and show these elements. So the next thing we need to do here is we also need to find our modal overlay. So let's just target this ID of modal here. So we'll call it overlay L equals document.query selector of the ID of modal. And here we're going to say overlay element dot class list dot add hidden. And that should work. I might have messed up something here. Class modal, constructor, close, close, close. Oh, I apologize. It should not be a function here. Class modal, and then constructor cannot call class as a function. What did I do wrong here? Ah, I apologize here. I messed this up. It's new modal, because we're creating a new modal instance. And now let's see if it works. We press X. Sweet. We press X. Sweet. So now we know that we can close and open modals doing this type of functionality. And that's kind of what we are going to do moving forward with the opening, the closing, the displaying, and all of that good stuff. So rather than doing everything inside of this construction function and creating all of these anonymous functions, let's clean it up just a little bit by creating a close modal function. So we'll say close modal equals overlay L dot class list dot add hidden, and here we could say instead of this anonymous function, we could say this dot close modal. But you're gonna notice right away this overlay element does not exist because this is scoped inside of this constructor. So how do we get access to this overlay element? All we need to do is just say this dot overlay element and this dot overlay element. So now we have access to this overlay element. And just for the sake of like kind of writing comments, we're gonna say this is the close button element, which is the X. This is the full modal overlay, and then this is the event listeners. Cool. So now that we've got that out of the way, let's work on creating the layout called the show offer. And that way we can kind of hook up the open and the close of the modals. So I'm gonna get rid of this. I'm gonna get rid of this, and I'm just gonna say hidden here so it's a little easier to see. And above this div and in between the main, I'm going to create a div with the class of content. And inside of this content, we're going to create a button with an ID of modal trigger. And here we're going to say show offer. And we're also going to do a p tag with offer accepted. So here, let's just do offer accepted, and we'll give it a class of modal text accept, I guess, modal accept, and let's just hide it for now. Cool. So basically, we can see that we just want to move this content to the center. And how do we do that? We can just style the main element and give it a just display flex with some 100% viewport height. So here above, we're going to say main height is 100% viewport height, display flex, justify content center, align items center. Cool. So now we know that works, but obviously the button doesn't work because we don't have anything hooked up to it. So now we need to go back into our JavaScript and figure out how do we trigger the open modal here, right? We know that we have a button with the ID of modal trigger. So let's kind of work with that. So here I'm going to say show offer button, or actually let's just call it the trigger button. And we'll call it const trigger button L equals document.query selector modal trigger. And we'll add trigger button dot add event listener of the click. And what do you think this second part's going to be? It's probably some reference to a open modal, right? But we don't have a open modal function. So what we can do here is create one. This dot overlay element dot class list dot remove hidden. We are removing the hidden class whenever we open a modal, and we are adding a hidden class whenever we want to hide it. Cool, so let's test this out. When I click show offer, it'll show the modal screen, and when I click X, it'll go out of the modal, which is exactly what we want. The next thing we want to do is when we click outside of the modal, we close the modal as well. So let's get to that. How we can do this right now is, if you think about it, our modal overlay is this whole container that's covering the show offer button. Anywhere we click on this modal overlay, we should be able to close the modal. So let's do that right now. So what I'm going to do is target this modal and add an event listener to it. So let's go to our index.js. We'll say this.overlay element.add event listener to the click. And here we'll say this.close modal. So let's see if that works. So show offer, click outside, show offer, click outside. But you'll notice a bug when we click show offer and you click the content inside, it'll also close the modal, which is not what we want to do. So how we can prevent this is by adding a event.stop propagation on the modal content itself. How we can do that is, first we have to target the modal content, and then we can add a handle content click management of some sort. So here we're gonna say modal content element and do codal and then do const modal content L equals document.query selector of modal content. And here, let's just add a event listener here, dot add event listener of the click. And here we'll call handle content click, and specifically this dot handle content click. And let's create this function. And we'll say, whoops, forgot the event, e dot stop propagation. Sweet, so let's test this out. When I click show offer, click outside, it closes the modal. When I click show offer, click inside, it doesn't close the modal. If you're unfamiliar with stop propagation and bubbling, I highly recommend you to look into that documentation. But definitely, this is one of those gotchas that you'll have to consider when creating a modal. You don't want the inside of the content to close the modal, only the button itself. All right, now that we got that out of the way, the next thing we want to do is when we click this accept offer, we want to be able to show that success page. And before we jump right into it, I want us to think about what this modal class represents. As simple as it sounds, the modal only cares about the modal. It doesn't care about what gets rendered if the modal gets closed and it's successful, or what happens when it gets closed, what it needs to render. All it cares about is that it opens and it closes. So ideally, the content of what should show up after you close the modal when a user clicks accept offer should be handled by whatever is calling or instantiating that modal class. So ideally, what we want to do is we don't want this modal to look for the content inside of this modal accept or modal trigger, but instead we want the entity that's calling this modal to handle that for us. It is a little confusing, but hopefully looking at the code, you'll have a better idea of what I'm trying to say. So just for the sake of this example, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create an anonymous function here that just does console.log accepting offer. And now that we accept the offer, we're going to be passing that here as a callback. So we're going to call it submit callback. And in that submit callback, we can just create our own this.submit callback, so we can call it within other functions. So let's just say this.submit, submit callback. So we'll call this.submit callback equals submit callback. And what we need to do is we need to do something whenever the user clicks the accept offer. So the modal only cares about closing the modal, and then it'll have access to this function called submit callback that will do whatever the parent function decides it wants to do after it closes the modal. So in this case, we're going to be console logging the accepting offer. So let's try to kind of hook that up right now. If you notice, the accept offer has a class of submit modal button. And I believe we did not have that defined. So let's do submit modal button const submit modal button L equals document. Actually, we could just do this dot overlay L dot query selector and look for the submit modal button. And let's add an event listener on the bottom. Submit modal button element dot add event listener of the click. And here we're going to say this dot handle submit. And in the handle submit, what we're going to do, and let's just do the easy one first, this dot close modal. So first, let's do show offer, accept offer, show offer, accept offer. Exactly what we're anticipating here. The next thing we want to do is we want to call this dot submit callback. And what do you expect to happen here? Whenever we click show offer, and now we click accept offer, what do you expect? In this case, it should be this console log accepting offer. So let's test that. Accepting offer. Perfect. So essentially, we don't want to actually just do console.log accepting offer. What we want to do is we want to hide and show either the offer accepted or the show offer element. So we can do this. Const submit callback equals, and we'll find those two elements, which is the modal trigger and the modal accept. So here we have the modal trigger, so let's just copy this one. And then const modal accept L equals document.query selector modal accept. Cool. And here we'll say trigger button element dot class list dot remove hidden. Actually, no, we want to add hidden because we want to hide it. And we want to have the modal accept element dot class list dot remove hidden. Perfect. Last but not least, we're going to just pass this bad boy into here. And let's see if it works. Show offer, accept offer, offer accepted. So everything is working properly now. We can click the button, we can close the modal, we can click the button, we can close the modal if you click outside of it. And last but not least, when you click show offer and accept the offer is now accepted. Everything is working to our liking, and at this point, we want to now include some refactoring options if you have time. So the first thing I would consider doing is creating a function called toggle visibility. And here we'll just do this.overlay element class list toggle hidden, which will either do a add or remove of our hidden class based on a certain parameter. So here just say is visible. And specifically, we want to apply the hidden class to things that aren't visible. So we're going to have to finagle this. And this is a Boolean. So here we'll call this.toggle visibility, and close modal means that it is not visible. And here we'll say this.toggle visibility true. And now when we show offer, click, show, click, it works exactly the same, but it's just a little bit of cleanup to think about. The last thing we can add, if you really have the time to do it, is we can kind of refactor this part a little bit. And if you think about this modal, we always talk about the reusability and the idea of that it shouldn't really know too much about what the parent is doing. But in this specific example we've been using, our JavaScript kind of knows about this modal ID. Ideally, rather than having the JavaScript just know about these elements within a modal, you want to somehow give it the data from the parent function that's calling it. So in this scenario, rather than the JavaScript knowing about this ID, how do we pass in the ID of modal to this class? And we could do this in a very clever way using our trigger button. So in here, we're going to give this button a data model ID of modal. And this modal is going to be a reference to this ID of modal in our JavaScript. And here, what we're going to do is we're going to pass in a trigger element or trigger selector actually. So here in our case, we're going to pass in the modal trigger like this. And if we go up, we'll just call it the trigger selector and submit callback. And all we need to do here is replace this modal trigger with the trigger selector. And if we console log out this trigger button element, it'll give us a pretty cool list of items. So trigger button L dot data set. And you'll notice that there is a reference to the model ID. And that is the same as the model ID defined in here, which is modal. So here we could say dataset.model ID, which is modal. And this is exactly what this upward modal is up here. So rather than just having us hard code the ID of modal, we could get the trigger button to give us that information since we added it in our data model ID. So here, now we can use string interpolation. So here we'll write trigger button dot data set dot model ID, and we'll put a reference to the ID here. And I might have misspelled it, trigger button L, so it's actually trigger button element. And then here, do that. Cool. So everything should just be working as normal. But ideally, what we're doing here is we're just changing the behavior of our modal class. Now the modal class is expecting to get a trigger selector that has a data model ID of whatever ID it provided. So here, the next time, maybe some other modal with a different ID is being used. So now we can open two separate modals, right? Using the same class, as opposed to just being tied to this one exact modal. So hopefully that made sense. And that would be something that would really help you stand out in these front-end interviews, is thinking about how do we scale these functionalities beyond the scope of this really tiny project. Now that we're finished, hopefully all of that made sense. If you're looking to do more front-end interview questions, I highly recommend you to check out Front-End Eval. There are a lot of great questions that range from easy, medium to hard. So it's going to be really nice for you to see what a front-end interview question could possibly be like. So definitely check them out, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.